The first time Letitia Boone rode into Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1878, she did so alone, with a rifle across her saddle, a jaw set hard as flint, and eyes that dared the whole world to say a single word about it. Nobody did. Not right away. She came from the east side of the Cimarron River, trailing a mule loaded with 2 trunks, a crate of mason jars, and a wooden sign she had painted herself that read BOONE's Dry Goods and General Supply in careful black letters. She tied her horse to the post outside the empty storefront on Chisholm Street, walked through the door like she owned the building, which, it turned out, she did, having purchased it by post 3 months prior, and began unpacking without so much as glancing at the 3 men who stopped on the boardwalk to stare. One of those men was Chester Pratt, who ran the only other dry goods establishment in Caldwell, and who did not take kindly to competition. Another was old Abe Simmons, who ran the livery and generally minded everyone's business as a second profession. The third was Deputy Roy Leland, who leaned against the post and scratched his jaw and said, mostly to himself, that he had never seen a woman unload a mule with quite that much authority. Word spread fast in a town like Caldwell. By supper time, the talk at Delilah's eating house was all about the widow woman, though some said she was never married, and others said she had been married twice and buried both husbands, which the more dramatic citizens took as a warning of some kind. Nobody knew for certain. Letitia Boone did not offer explanations. She opened her store the very next morning, arranged her shelves with a precision that would have made a military quartermaster proud, and set prices that were fair enough to draw customers from across town. Chester Pratt came to her door that first week with what he called a neighborly visit, and what everyone could plainly see was a warning wrapped in pleasantries. He was a broad man of 50, with a gray mustache and small eyes that had grown smaller over years of watching people for leverage. He stood in the middle of her store and looked around slowly, the way a man looks at something he intends to own one day. "It's a brave thing," he said, "a woman running a business alone out here. Caldwell's a rough place. Cattle trail goes right through the middle of town. Drovers come up from Texas every spring, and they are not always gentlemen." Letitia was arranging bolts of calico on the second shelf and did not turn around. "I have a rifle, Mr. Pratt," she said, "and I know how to use it. Thank you for stopping by." He left, and after that people started to understand what kind of woman had come to live among them. She was 28 years old, though some guessed younger because her face had not yet hardened into the lines that the Kansas wind eventually carved into everyone. She had brown hair that she wore pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat, green eyes that caught light the way river water does on a clear afternoon, and hands that were not soft. She kept the store 6 days a week, attended church on Sunday without being particularly devout, paid her accounts on time, and never once asked anyone for anything. That last part was the thing people noticed most. In 1878 Kansas, a single woman was expected to need things. She was expected to need a man to lift her heavy crates, a neighbor woman to help her with her laundry, a minister's wife to guide her social life, and a banker's approval to conduct her business. Letitia Boone needed none of it. She lifted her own crates. She did her own laundry in a washtub behind the store on Wednesday evenings. She was perfectly kind to the minister's wife and perfectly uninterested in being guided. And she had sent the bank in Wichita such a clear and thoroughly documented application for her business credit that the bank manager had approved it without asking a single follow-up question. Margaret Healy, who was the postmistress and the most reliable source of information in all of Caldwell, summed it up one afternoon over coffee with 3 other women. "She told me herself," Margaret said, stirring her cup with the air of someone delivering a verdict. "I said to her, you must get lonely running that store by yourself, and she looked at me and said, Margaret, I have never been lonely a day in my life. I keep excellent company with my own thoughts." Margaret set down her spoon, and I believe her completely. So the story of Letitia Boone, as told in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring and summer of 1878, was simple. She needed no one. She had said so, clearly and without apology. And the town, with a mixture of respect and something close to awe, believed her. Isaiah Dawson arrived in Caldwell on the 14th of June, 1878, riding a dark bay horse and trailing a reputation that had come up the cattle trail a week ahead of him. He was a drover by trade, but not one of the wild young Texans who came up the Chisholm Trail every season making noise and breaking things. He was 32, built lean and solid the way men get who spend most of their lives outdoors doing real work, with dark brown hair that had gone slightly long under his hat, and a face that was weathered in a way that suggested experience rather than age. He had gray eyes, which was unusual enough in Caldwell that 2 separate women mentioned them to their husbands within the first day of his arrival. He had been driving cattle for 12 years since he was 20, first for other men and then for himself. He was not wealthy, but he was solvent, which in Caldwell in 1878 put him ahead of most. He had driven a small herd of his own up from Texas, 43 head of good longhorns, sold them to a buyer in Wichita, and then ridden back through Caldwell with no particular urgency and no particular plan. He had been through Caldwell before a few years back, when it was a wilder place. He was mildly curious to see what it had become. What it had become was still rough around the edges, but working hard at respectability. There was a hotel, 2 saloons, a bank, a church that was also sometimes a schoolhouse, a barber shop, Delilah's eating house, Old Abe's livery, Chester Pratt's dry goods, and this was New Boone's dry goods and general supply on Chisholm Street, with a clean front window and a painted sign that he admired briefly before walking past it. He took a room at the hotel. He ate supper at Delilah's. He was quiet and did not seek out trouble, which already put him in the upper half of Caldwell's seasonal visitors. He went into Boone's dry goods on his second morning in town because he needed a new pair of work gloves and some salt and 2 lengths of rope. He walked in, found the shelves arranged with admirable efficiency, and was looking at the gloves when a voice behind him said, "Those are the better ones on the left. The ones on the right look sturdier, but the stitching pulls out after about a month of hard work." He turned around. Letitia Boone was behind the counter, watching him with those green eyes that caught the morning light coming through the window. She was wearing a blue dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair pinned up, and she looked entirely unsurprised by his existence, which for some reason he found more interesting than if she had looked pleased to see him. "Good to know," he said. "I'll take the left ones. Salt is in the back corner, rope is on the south wall. What length are you needing?" 12 feet each, she nodded. He gathered what he needed, brought it to the counter, and she added everything up in her head without writing anything down, which he noticed. "You're good with numbers," he said without thinking. "Yes," she said. "I am." He paid. He said thank you. She said you're welcome. He left. That was the whole of their first meeting, and he found himself thinking about it later in a way that was disproportionate to how much had actually happened. He stayed in Caldwell for reasons that were not entirely clear to him at first. He told himself it was because the territory west of town needed looking at. He had heard from a cattle buyer in Wichita that there might be grazing land available for lease if a man wanted to put down stakes and build a small operation rather than driving cattle up from Texas every season. That was a real and valid reason. He rode out and looked at the land, and it was genuinely promising. That part was true. The other part, the part where he found himself walking past Boone's dry goods more often than strictly necessary, the part where he chose Boone's for his supplies every time rather than Chester Pratt's, which was closer to the hotel, that part he did not examine too closely. He bought things he needed. He made conversation about those things. Letitia was not unfriendly. She was simply contained the way a river is contained by its banks. She answered questions directly, offered useful information about goods and prices, remembered what he had purchased previously, and never once invited anything that could be called personal conversation. He asked her once, a week into his extended stay, whether she had been in Caldwell long. "Since April," she said. "A little over 2 months. Where did you come from before?" She looked at him, not with hostility, more with the expression of someone determining whether a question was worth answering. "Missouri," she said. "Long way to come alone," he said. "Not so long," she said, "if you know the way." She turned back to her inventory ledger, and he recognized a closed door when he saw one. He went away and thought about Missouri and what might make a woman pack everything she had and ride alone to Caldwell, Kansas, and open a dry goods store like she was building a fortress rather than a business. He thought about it, and then told himself it was none of his concern, and went to look at the grazing land again. The summer moved along in the way that Kansas summers do, with a heat that sits on the skin like a second skin, and afternoons so bright they bleached the color out of the sky. The cattle drovers came and went in waves, ragged, sun-baked young men who had been on the trail for 3 months and wanted whiskey and noise and company. Caldwell handled them with the practiced exhaustion of a town that had done this before. Isaiah found himself settling into a rhythm that he had not planned on. He rode out to the leased land in the mornings and walked it and took notes in a small book about water access and grass quality and the distance to the nearest rail point. He ate at Delilah's. He helped old Abe Simmons mend a fence at the livery one afternoon simply because he was walking past and saw the old man struggling with it. And afterward Abe told him he was a good man and offered him a glass of water, which Isaiah accepted. He went into Boone's dry goods perhaps 3 times a week. Margaret Healy, who noticed everything, noticed this. Margaret was the kind of woman who would not gossip maliciously, but absolutely could not resist a good story. And she considered the story of Letitia Boone and the quiet drover who kept buying things. He probably already had to be very good indeed. She mentioned it to 2 people, which in Caldwell was the same as announcing it in the town square. Letitia heard about it from Cora Simmons, Abe's daughter-in-law, who brought it up with the best intentions and the worst timing on a Thursday afternoon when Letitia was trying to reconcile her accounts. "People are starting to say," Cora said carefully, "that Isaiah Dawson might be sweet on you." Letitia did not look up from her ledger. "People can say what they like," she said. "He is very handsome," Cora offered. "I hadn't noticed," Letitia said, which was an absolute lie and probably the first deliberate lie she had told since coming to Caldwell, and she was aware of that, and the awareness sat uncomfortably in her chest for the rest of the afternoon, because she had noticed. She had noticed from the very first morning he walked through her door. She had noticed the way he moved, careful and unhurried. She had noticed that he said thank you and meant it. She had noticed that he asked about Missouri, not to pry, but with what seemed like genuine human curiosity. She had noticed that he did not do what men often did when she declined to continue a conversation. He did not push, did not become cold, did not look offended. He simply accepted it, which was so unusual that she had thought about it more than once in the evenings when the store was closed and the town settled into its summer noise, and she sat in the back room with her ledger and her lamp and her own very good company. She had been keeping excellent company with her own thoughts for a long time. She had grown up in Joplin, Missouri, the daughter of a hardware merchant who had taught her to read his account books before she could read anything else, and who had told her, plainly and without apology, that the world would try to make her small, but she did not have to agree to it. Her father was the best man she had ever known, and he had died of a fever when she was 19. And after that everything had gotten harder in ways she had not fully anticipated. She had married at 22. His name was Thomas Boone. She had kept his surname because it was on the deed to the store and on her business correspondence, and she saw no reason to change it back. Thomas had been charming before the wedding and difficult after it, and the difficulty had compounded year over year, until at 27 she had looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand in their Joplin house and understood, with complete clarity, that she had disappeared. That the woman who looked back at her had been eroded by 6 years of being told she was wrong about everything, of being told she was too independent and too sharp and too much, of being told that a good wife was a soft one, until she had become so careful and so quiet that she had almost convinced herself this was simply who she was. Thomas had not been violent. She wanted to be fair about that. He had not struck her, he had only made her small. She had waited until he went to St. Louis on a business trip, and then she had taken her father's savings, which Thomas had not known about because she had been keeping excellent books for years, and had managed to put money aside in accounts he did not know existed, which her father had taught her to do not for deception but for security. And she had bought the storefront in Caldwell by post and packed her things and left a letter that was polite and final. She was 28 years old and she was done being made small. She had told Margaret Healy, in all honesty, that she had never been lonely a day in her life. What she had not told Margaret Healy was that the reason she was so certain was that loneliness was infinitely preferable to what she had experienced in 6 years of marriage. She kept excellent company with her own thoughts because her own thoughts were reliable, and her own thoughts did not slowly convince her that she was less than she was. She did not need anyone. She had thought about it very carefully, and she was certain of it. She needed the business and the independence and the Kansas sky that went on forever, and the feeling of walking into her own store every morning, and knowing it was hers, and no one could take it. She did not need Isaiah Dawson, with his gray eyes and his unhurried way of moving and his small questions that somehow managed not to be intrusive. She put it out of her mind and balanced her accounts. It was a Saturday evening in late June when Chester Pratt made his second visit to Boone's Dry Goods, and this time he did not wrap his warning in pleasantries. She had stayed late to reorganize the hardware section, and the store was empty, and the street outside was beginning to fill with the Saturday evening noise drovers from the cattle camps coming in for the weekend, boots on the boardwalk, laughter from the direction of the saloons. She heard the door and looked up, and it was Pratt, and he had brought with him a man she did not know, heavyset and deliberate, who stood by the door with his arms crossed. "Miss Boone," Pratt said. He did not use the Mrs., which she had not asked for but which was technically accurate, and which she suspected he omitted on purpose. "I'd like to have a business conversation with you. You're welcome to come back Monday morning during regular hours," she said. She did not move from behind the counter. "I'll have it now," he said. "I've been patient. I expected you to realize after a few months that this is not an easy place for a woman alone. I thought you might be interested in a partnership arrangement. I'd take on the management side. You'd have a reliable income without the difficulty of running things yourself." "I am running things myself without difficulty," she said. "Thank you for the offer." "No." Pratt's small eyes got smaller. "I'm not sure you understand what I'm offering." "I understand exactly what you're offering," she said. "You're offering to take my store away from me at a low price by making yourself necessary. I am not interested." "Good evening, Mr. Pratt." The heavy-set man by the door shifted his weight. It was not quite a threat. It was the shadow of one. Letitia reached under the counter and put her hand on the rifle she kept there and left it where it was, but made sure Pratt could see that she had done it. "Good evening," she said again. Pratt looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He turned around and left, and the heavy-set man followed him. She stood very still for a minute after they were gone, her hand on the rifle, and then she took her hand away and looked at it and was relieved to find it was not shaking. She was not going to give them the satisfaction of a shaking hand, not even in private. She locked the store and walked back to the small room she rented behind the bank. She was saving money before committing to a proper house, and sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall and thought, for the first time since coming to Caldwell, that things might be more complicated than she had anticipated. She did not cry. She was not going to cry. She had not cried in a very long time, and she intended to keep that record. What she did not know was that Isaiah Dawson had been walking back from the livery on the opposite side of the street when Pratt and his man came out of her store. He had seen their faces. He had seen Pratt's jaw and the set of the other man's shoulders. He stood on the boardwalk in the soft Saturday evening light and looked at the closed door of Boone's Dry Goods and felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard the stories about Pratt. Margaret Healy, who seemed to have adopted him as a kind of nephew in the weeks he had been in Caldwell, had told him about Pratt's previous attempts to buy out smaller businesses on Chisholm Street, about the man who had sold him a saddle shop 2 years ago for almost nothing after a string of unexplained bad luck, about the woman who had tried to run a seamstress business and given up after Pratt's men took to blocking her door on busy afternoons. She had said it the way people in a town say things about a power they do not feel able to change, with resignation and a slight lowering of the voice. Isaiah turned these things over in his mind. He told himself it was not his business. He told himself that Letitia Boone was the most self-sufficient woman he had ever encountered, and she would handle whatever needed handling. He told himself he did not have the right to involve himself. He did not sleep well that night. The next morning was Sunday, and Letitia was not at church, which was not unusual since her attendance was irregular. What was unusual was that on Sunday evening, when the town was quieter and the drovers had mostly returned to their camps, she was not in the store. She sometimes worked on Sundays despite nominally closing, and not in the little room behind the bank, because he walked past it on his way to the hotel and there was no light under the door. He found himself walking toward the river. The Chikaskia River ran half a mile south of Caldwell, and in the summer evenings people sometimes walked down to it for the coolness and the sound of the water. It was not a dramatic river, not wide or deep enough to be threatening, but it was constant and quiet, and the cottonwood trees along its banks provided the only reliable shade for some distance. He was not looking for her. He was walking, he told himself, because he could not sleep and the evening was warm and a walk was reasonable. He heard her before he saw her, not loudly. It was not the kind of crying that announces itself. It was the kind that a person does when they are trying very hard not to, when they have held something inside for a long time, and the evening and the solitude and the sound of running water have finally worn through the wall they built around it. Small, controlled sounds, a sharp breath, the kind of quiet grief that is all the more striking for being so carefully contained. He stopped at the edge of the cottonwood trees. She was sitting on a flat rock at the river's edge, her boots off, her feet in the current, her knees pulled up and her arms wrapped around them. Her hat was beside her on the rock. Her hair had come partially down. She was looking at the water and she was crying, and she was doing it alone in the dark, where no one was supposed to see. Isaiah Dawson stood at the edge of the trees and felt something shift inside him that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with recognition. He had known people who built walls. He had been a person who built walls. He knew what it looked like when the wall gave way in a place where the person thought they were safe. He should have turned around. He knew that. Every reasonable instinct said to give her the privacy she had come down here specifically to have. He stood there for another moment. Then he did something that was either very right or very wrong, and he would not know which until later. He sat down on a fallen log about 10 feet from the rock, not between her and the path back to town, but nearby enough that he was clearly there, and he said quietly, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." She went absolutely rigid. She turned and looked at him with an expression that was first startled and then furious, and then, very briefly, before she shut it away, something more complicated and more vulnerable. "How long have you been there?" she said. Her voice was even. She had recovered with a speed that was remarkable. 10 seconds, he said. "Roughly, I was going to leave. I'm still going to leave if you want. I didn't want to slip away without you knowing I'd been here, because that seemed worse." She stared at him. He met her stare and did not look away, but he also did not push. He waited. She looked back at the river. "I saw Pratt come out of your store last night," he said. "I don't know what was said. You don't have to tell me." "No," she said, "I don't." "No," he agreed. "You don't." Silence. The river moved past the rock. A night bird called from somewhere in the cottonwoods. "He wants my store," she said finally. Not because she needed to tell him, but because the words wanted out and the wall was already down, at least partially, and the effort of rebuilding it right now was more than she had available. "I figured," he said. "I told him no." "I know you did," he said. She looked at him again. "How do you know?" "Because you're sitting here by the river instead of packing your things," he said. "Which is what you'd be doing if you'd said yes to anything that man wanted." Something moved in her expression. She looked away again. He had someone with him, a large man. They were suggesting things without saying them. "I noticed," he said. "I had my rifle." "I know you did. I know you can handle yourself." "Then why are you here?" she said, and it came out sharper than she intended, sharp enough that she heard it herself and added more quietly, "I mean that genuinely. I am not being unkind. I want to understand what you think you're doing." He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer honestly. "I don't entirely know," he said. "I think I was worried." I think the worry felt more honest than pretending I wasn't. She was quiet. The river said whatever rivers say at night. The cottonwood leaves moved in the slight breeze that came up off the water. "I cried," she said abruptly, "in case you didn't realize." "I know," he said. "I didn't see much, but enough." "I don't usually," she said. The words were careful, as if she was giving them one at a time and could take them back if necessary. "Cry. I don't find it useful generally." "Sometimes it happens anyway," he said, "even to useful people." A long pause. Then, astonishingly, she made a sound that was almost a laugh, not quite, but close to the territory. "You are a strange man, Isaiah Dawson," she said. He had not told her his name. He registered this. "You know who I am," he said. "Everybody knows who you are," she said. "You've been in my store every other day for 4 weeks." "Fair enough," he said. She uncurled slightly from her tight position on the rock. She put her feet back in the water and looked at them. "I'm not going to let him take my store," she said. It was not directed at Isaiah specifically. It was more like a statement to the river, or to herself, being said aloud to make it more real. "I came here and I built something. I am not going to let a man with small eyes and large ideas take it from me." "No," he said. "You're not." "I wasn't asking your opinion," she said. "I know," he said. "I was agreeing." Another pause that was slightly different from the previous pauses, slightly less defended. She reached up and pushed a strand of hair back from her face. "You should go back," she said. "People will talk." "People are already talking," he said mildly. "Margaret Healy told me approximately everything there is to know about this town's opinion of the situation between us." She turned to look at him sharply. "There is no situation between us." He met her gaze. In the near dark his gray eyes were very steady. "I know," he said. "That's what I told her." She held his gaze for a moment longer, and then something in her face shifted in a way she clearly did not intend to allow, and she looked away at the river. "You should go back," she said again. "All right," he said. He stood up. He did not make it theatrical or significant. He simply stood. "Miss Boone, I hope you sleep well tonight." He started back through the cottonwood trees toward town. "Mrs.," she said quietly behind him. "It's Mrs. technically. My husband is still alive. We are separated." "Permanently?" He stopped. He turned around. "I see," he said. "I'm telling you because people will find out eventually, and you should know what the situation is before you decide what you're agreeing and disagreeing with," she said. "Thank you for telling me," he said. She said nothing more. He walked back through the trees and she stayed by the river, and after a while the crying did not come back, and she sat in the dark with her feet in the water and felt something she did not have an immediate name for. It was not comfort, exactly. It was the feeling of having been seen and not diminished by it. It was a feeling she had forgotten was possible. She pushed it firmly aside and put her boots back on and walked back to town. The next several weeks brought a development that Letitia had not entirely anticipated, which was that Isaiah Dawson turned out to be helpful in ways that were entirely practical and difficult to refuse. He did not do things for her. He did things beside her, which was a distinction she found herself paying close attention to. When Chester Pratt's heavyset associate began standing near the front of Boone's Dry Goods during the morning hours on a Tuesday, not entering, simply standing there in a way that was designed to discourage customers, Isaiah happened to be passing and happened to stop, and happened to engage the man in a leisurely and entirely friendly conversation about the weather, the cattle market, and the relative merits of different types of work gloves, for approximately 45 minutes. until the man grew thoroughly bored and left. He did not tell Letitia he had done this. She saw it through the window. When the water barrel behind her store developed a crack and she was trying to figure out how to roll the barrel to the Cooper 3 blocks away by herself, Isaiah was walking past and simply put his hands on the other end. She looked at him. He looked at her. "It rolls better with two," he said. "I know," she said. "Thank you." They rolled the barrel together. He did not use it as an occasion for conversation. When Cora Simmons told her that Pratt had been making inquiries at the bank in Wichita about Letitia's credit arrangement, trying to find some weakness in the financial foundation, Letitia spent 2 days drafting a thorough letter to her bank contact, making sure all her documentation was impeccable and her accounts were current. Isaiah came into the store on the second afternoon and found her at the counter surrounded by papers, and asked if there was anything he could do that would not be taken as overstepping. And she looked at the papers and looked at him and said, "You mentioned once that you sold your herd through a broker in Wichita. Do you know anyone at the First Commercial Bank there?" He did. He wrote a brief letter of his own to a man he knew who happened to work in commercial lending, simply attesting that Letitia Boone was a person of excellent business acumen whose operation he had observed and thought well of. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing men did for each other as a matter of course, and that women almost never had access to. He gave it to her and she read it and folded it carefully. "This is useful," she said. "I thought it might be," he said. "You did not ask my permission before writing it," she said. "No," he said. "I should have. I'm sorry." She looked at the letter again. "Don't apologize. It was useful. I'm just noting it." "Noted," he said. She sent the letter. The thing that was building between them did not have a name yet. It had been nameless long enough that Letitia had almost managed to convince herself it was not building at all, that it was simply the practical arrangement of two self-sufficient people operating in close proximity. She was very good at convincing herself of things when she tried. She had grown up watching her father do brilliant mathematics, and she had inherited his logical mind, and she could construct an argument for almost any position if she worked at it hard enough. But the argument was getting harder to construct. She noticed, she was forced to admit, that she looked up when the door opened. She noticed that when it was not him she experienced a very brief, very small disappointment that she immediately set aside. She noticed that when Cora Simmons said one afternoon that Isaiah had been seen talking to the new school teacher, a young woman from Ohio who had arrived in June, something moved through Letitia's chest that was not entirely charitable, and was not, if she was honest, consistent with a person who felt nothing about the man. She was not going to be made a fool of by her own emotions. She had learned that lesson at considerable cost. But she was slowly discovering, getting tired of the argument. The crisis with Pratt came to a head on a Thursday in late July, when Letitia came to open her store in the morning and found the front window broken. A rock, nothing sophisticated or clever. Just a rock thrown through the glass in the night, and whoever had thrown it had also knocked over the 2 display items she kept in the window, a bolt of red calico and a set of copper cooking pots, so that they were visible from the street in their tumbled state, advertising disorder. She stood in the street and looked at it. Her hands did not shake, but the space behind her sternum was very cold. Deputy Roy Leland came by while she was surveying the damage. He made sympathetic sounds and wrote things in his small book, and told her these things happened sometimes, and it was probably just drovers who'd had too much Saturday. It was Thursday and they both knew it, and there was not much to be done. He said he would ask around. She thanked him politely and knew with complete certainty that he would not ask around, because Roy Leland was not a bad man, but he was a careful one, and careful men in Caldwell did not make enemies of Chester Pratt. She went inside and began cleaning up the glass. Isaiah arrived at the store shortly after she had opened it, having heard from Abe Simmons about the window before 8 in the morning, because Abe Simmons heard everything. He stood in the doorway and looked at the boarded-up space where the window had been, She had already nailed a piece of board from the back over it and looked at her, sweeping glass from the floor with methodical strokes. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine," she said. "It's a window." "It's more than a window," he said quietly. She swept a pile of glass into the dustpan. "I know that," she said. "But right now it's a window and I'm sweeping it up, and then I am going to open my store and serve customers the same as I do every Thursday, because the moment I do anything different is the moment I give him a reason to think this worked." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'll go find a glazier for the glass. Frank Henley up on the north end does that kind of work. You shouldn't have to look for him while you're running the store." She stopped sweeping. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," he said. A pause. She looked at him. He looked at her with those even gray eyes that were, she had to admit to herself at some point in the past several weeks, exactly as steady as they appeared to be. Not performing steadiness, just steady. "Thank you," she said. She went back to sweeping. He came back at noon with Frank Henley, who measured the window and quoted her a fair price and said he could have glass in by Saturday. She said Saturday was fine. She paid a deposit from the money box under the counter, and Isaiah went back out and came back 20 minutes later with a plate of food from Delilah's eating house, which he put on the counter without fanfare. "You haven't eaten," he said. "How do you know that?" she said. "You haven't left the store since 7 this morning," he said. "I've been close enough to notice." She looked at the plate. It had cornbread and beans and a slice of ham. It was exactly what she would have ordered. "Have you been watching me?" she said. She did not mean it as an accusation. "I've been nearby," he said, "in case it happened again." "In case Pratt's man threw another rock," she said. "Yes," he said. She was quiet. She looked at the food. She said, "Isaiah." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both registered it. "I have managed things myself for a long time. I am not fragile." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" She said, the same question she had asked at the river, but different now. Different because she was asking it in daylight in her store, with both of them standing there with no darkness to hide the asking. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because when I imagine not being nearby, I find I don't like the feeling. And I'm a man who tends to do what makes sense to him, and being nearby makes sense to me. More sense than anything else I've done in a long time." The store was empty. The clock on the wall measured out seconds. The street was doing its Thursday business outside. Letitia set the broom against the counter. She looked at him with those green eyes, and whatever she was feeling was complicated, and a little frightening, and something she had not felt in a long time. Not the eroded, obligated feeling of a bad marriage, but the real and sharp and slightly terrifying feeling of genuine interest in another person. "Eat your food," he said gently, because he could see she was in the middle of something and he was not going to push. She sat down on the stool behind the counter and ate her food. He sat on the chair near the door that she kept there for customers who needed a moment to think, and he did not say anything, and the afternoon sunlight came through the boarded window at an angle that left the store in partial shadow, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in anyone's company in longer than she could accurately remember. She said, "I left my husband 10 months ago." He did not express surprise or judgment. He waited. "He was not a cruel man," she said. She had said this to herself before, but it was different said aloud to another person. "He did not hit me or threaten me. He simply reduced things. Everything I thought and felt and did, he had a way of making smaller. Over time, I became a smaller person. I left because I understood that if I stayed long enough, I would disappear entirely." She said it precisely and without sentiment. It was not a bid for sympathy. It was a statement of fact, offered because she thought he deserved to have it. "I understand that," he said. "Not the same circumstances. But I know what it feels like to be in a situation that takes more from you than it gives until there's nothing left." She looked at him. "What was your situation?" she said. "A partnership," he said. "Business, not marriage. A man I drove cattle with for 5 years. I trusted him. He made decisions that should have been made jointly, and when the results were bad, I was the one left holding the debt. I spent 3 years paying it off." He paused. "It teaches you to be careful about trust. Yes, she said, it does. A long quiet, not uncomfortable. I have been very careful, she said. Since coming here, I have been very careful not to need anyone because needing people has not historically gone well for me. I know, he said. I've noticed that. Has the whole town noticed? She said, the whole town has noticed, he said. They respect you for it. Do they think it's sad, she said. Some do, he said. Some think it's remarkable. I am in the second group. She looked at him for a long moment. I don't know what I'm doing, she said, and it cost her something to say it because she was not a person who admitted to not knowing things. Neither do I, he said. Not exactly, but I don't think that's necessarily a problem. She looked out the partially boarded window at the street. I am not going to be made small again, she said. Not by anyone. That is not a negotiable thing. It shouldn't be negotiable, he said. Anyone who wanted to make you smaller would be an idiot, and I am not an idiot. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before, not in all the weeks of visiting the store, not at the river in the dark. It was unguarded in a way that he suspected she almost never was, and it lasted only a moment before she put something careful back over it. But he had seen it, and it was the kind of thing that a man does not easily forget. The matter of Chester Pratt did not resolve itself quietly. 3 days after the broken window, Isaiah went to see Pratt directly. He did this without telling Letitia, not because he was trying to manage things behind her back, but because he knew she would tell him not to, and he had thought about it carefully and believed it needed doing. He went to Pratt's store in the mid-morning and walked through it to the back room where Pratt kept his office, which was a small room full of ledgers and the smell of cigar smoke, and he sat down across from Pratt's desk without being invited. Mr. Dawson, Pratt said, with the careful pleasantness of a man who is calculating something. Mr. Pratt, Isaiah said, I'll be brief. I have been in this town for over a month and I intend to stay. I have leased grazing land south of town, and I am in the process of establishing a small cattle operation, which means I will be a regular presence here for the foreseeable future. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that anything that happens on Chisholm Street I am going to notice, and I am going to take an active interest in seeing that businesses on Chisholm Street are treated fairly. Pratt leaned back in his chair. That's a broad statement, he said. It's meant to be, Isaiah said. I'm a plain-speaking man. I don't think we need to say anything more specific than that. Pratt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're sweet on the Boone woman. That is not relevant to what I'm saying, Isaiah said. I think it's very relevant, Pratt said. Then you're misunderstanding the nature of what I said, Isaiah told him. I'm not here because of any personal interest. I'm here because what you've been doing is wrong and you know it's wrong, and I am telling you as plainly as I know how that I will be watching. That's all. He stood up. Good morning, Mr. Pratt. He walked out. He knew it was not over. Men like Pratt did not back down from a single conversation. But sometimes a conversation was the thing that shifted the balance just enough to change what the next move looked like. He had learned that in 12 years of cattle driving, negotiating with buyers and range bosses and trail bosses, which was essentially the same skill as negotiating with human nature. Pratt did not send anyone to throw rocks again. Whether that was because of the conversation or because he had decided to try a different strategy, Isaiah could not be sure. When he told Letitia what he had done 2 days later because he was going to tell her, he simply needed the right moment. She was very still for a long time. Then she said, You went to his office. Yes, he said. Without telling me first, she said. Yes, he said, I should have. Yes, she said, you should have. A pause. What exactly did you say to him? He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, You told him you were going to watch what happened on Chisholm Street, not that you were protecting my store specifically. That's right, he said. That was smart, she said, making it broader, less personal. I thought so, he said, though it is personal. She looked at him. I know, she said. Another quiet between them, but different from the earlier quiets. There was something warm in it now. Something that had not been there before the river, before the broken window, before cornbread and beans and half an afternoon in the store, with the light coming in at an angle. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without arguing." "All right," he said. "I am not able to promise you anything," she said. "I am not in a position to offer anyone the normal things. I am not divorced because the law here makes that very difficult for a woman, and even if I were, I have spent the better part of a year learning how to not need anyone, and I am not entirely sure that process is reversible." He was listening. "I also want to be honest," she said, "because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfortable evasion. And the honest thing is that I have been looking up when the door opens for weeks, and I was not happy when I heard you talking to the schoolteacher from Ohio, and when you brought food from Delilah's, I ate every bite of it, and it was the most comfortable I have felt in 2 years." She said all of this in the same even, precise tone she used for accounting and inventory, as if she were presenting facts rather than feelings, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly how she processed feelings when she had to say them aloud. He did not say anything immediately. He looked at her in the afternoon light coming through the fully repaired window. Frank Henley had done good work on a Saturday, and he thought that she was the most extraordinarily careful and determined person he had ever encountered, and that the careful and the determined were not walls, they were her, they were who she was, and the last thing he wanted was to change any of it. "I am not asking you to promise me anything," he said. "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not going anywhere. I have cattle land to the south, and accounts to settle with a glazier and a room at the hotel that I'm considering turning into something more permanent." He paused. "I think you're worth being patient about. I think you're worth waiting for however long it takes for the waiting to make sense. And if it never makes sense, then I will have spent a year in a place I like, building something I believe in, near a woman I respect enormously. That is not a bad way to spend a year." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "You are a strange man." "You have mentioned that," he said. "I'll mention it again," she said. "It is consistently true." He left her to close up the store and walked back toward the hotel with the particular feeling of a man who has said a true thing and does not regret it. August in Caldwell was full of dust and heat, and the last of the summer cattle drives coming through, and life was loud and busy, and the town smelled of longhorns and leather and campfire smoke from the drovers' camps along the edge of town. Letitia kept the store at full capacity and expanded her inventory to include things the drovers needed: saddle leather, extra canteen straps, harness buckles, dried beef already wrapped for trail use. And her revenue in August was better than both June and July combined. She wrote it in her ledger with satisfaction. Isaiah worked on the land to the south of town, which he had leased from a rancher named Holcomb who was getting on in years and had no sons to leave it to. He had brought a small number of cattle up from contacts in Texas, 10 head to start, good breeding stock, and he was building a proper corral and making plans for a small house. He asked Letitia if she would ride out and look at the land with him one Sunday when both of them had time, and she said yes before she had fully decided to, and then was glad she had. The land was beautiful. She had not expected it to be beautiful. She had come to Kansas thinking of it as a practical place, a place for enterprise and independence, not a beautiful place. But riding out south of town on a clear August Sunday, with the grass moving in the warm wind and the sky going on in every direction and the line of cottonwoods marking where the creek ran through the lower part of the property, she felt something open up in her chest that she had been keeping closed for a long time. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. He was watching her face more than the land, which she knew and did not object to. "You're going to stay," she said, not a question, a realization. "Yes," he said. She looked at the cottonwood line along the creek. "It's a good place to stay," she said. He did not push it further. They rode back to town in the warm afternoon and tied their horses outside Delilah's and had coffee together, which they had not done before. Coffee at Delilah's in the afternoon, like two people who took coffee together as a matter of course, and Margaret Healy walked past the window and nearly fell over with happiness. Autumn came to Caldwell with a change in the light that made everything golden, and a little sad and very beautiful. The cattle drives were done for the season, and the town settled into its winter quietness, and Letitia rearranged her inventory for the colder months: wool blankets, heavier coats, extra lamp oil, winter supplies. She added a small pot of tea to her mornings, which she had not bothered with in the summer, and on the days when Isaiah stopped by the store, she made 2 cups without discussing it. They had coffee or tea together most mornings now, in the store or at Delilah's if the day was slow. They talked about the land and the cattle and the inventory and the town and the weather and the books. She was surprised to discover he read a great deal for a man who had spent most of his life outdoors, and she was even more surprised to find that his opinions on what he read were worth arguing with, which she did, regularly and enjoyably. She told him about her father. He told her about his family in Georgia. He had grown up in Georgia after the war, in the long, difficult years when Georgia was not an easy place for many people. His father had been a man who worked hard and expected the same from his children. He had 3 sisters, all married, all living in Georgia still. He wrote letters to them every few months. She told him about Thomas, not all of it at once, but pieces over several conversations spread across October into November. What it had been like at the beginning, how gradually the undermining had worked, how she had not understood what was happening until she looked in the mirror at 27 and did not recognize herself. He listened to all of it with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything, and when she was done with each piece, he did not say that Thomas was a monster, though she suspected he thought something in that direction. He simply said things that were true and measured, like, "That took courage, what you did, and your instinct to leave was the right one." And she found that the not overstating mattered more to her than the dramatic version would have. In November she mentioned, almost casually, that she had been in correspondence with a solicitor in Missouri. The laws were difficult, as she had said, but there were paths. She did not say it was about the marriage specifically. She said she was exploring legal arrangements that might clarify her situation. He understood what she meant, and he did not make it significant or celebratory. He said he hoped the legal correspondence went smoothly. She said she hoped so too. On a Saturday evening in December, when the first real cold had come down off the north and the town was quiet and the prairie outside was silver with frost under a full moon, Isaiah walked to Boone's dry goods at closing time and knocked on the door, which was already locked, and she opened it. "I have something to say," he said. "Come in then," she said. "It's cold." He came in. The store was warm from the stove in the back corner. It smelled of wool and leather and the faint sweetness of the hard candy she kept in a jar by the register. She stood behind the counter and looked at him. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most things, simply and without elaboration, as if it were a fact he had checked and found to be accurate. "I have been trying to find the right time to say it, and I think there probably isn't a right time, so I'm saying it now." She was very still. "I am not asking you to say it back," he said. "I am not asking you to do anything about it except know it. I thought you deserved to know." She looked at him for what felt like a long time. The stove ticked. The December wind said something against the window. "Isaiah," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear what was under the steadiness because he had learned to listen for it. "I have been trying for 6 months to convince myself that this was a practical arrangement between 2 rational people who happen to share similar goals and adjacent properties." "How's that going?" he said. "Terribly," she said. "I have been failing at it comprehensively." He held very still. "I don't know what love looks like for me," she said. "I thought I knew, and it turned out I was wrong, and that has made me very cautious about the word." She came around the counter. She was wearing her winter dress, dark green wool, with her hair down because she was closing up and she always let it down when she closed. She stopped a few feet from him. "But I know that the store is quieter when you haven't come by. I know that when I think about the land to the south, I think of it as belonging to both of us in a way that I have not given anyone permission to do. I know that when I try to imagine next year without you in the picture, the picture doesn't look right." She looked at him directly. "I think that is probably love," she said, "or near enough to it." He reached out and took her hand, which she had not offered but which she did not withdraw. It was the first time they had touched with intention. He held her hand in both of his and said nothing, because there was nothing necessary to say. She looked down at their hands and then up at his face, and then she did something she had not done in any calculated way in years, which was to simply stop arguing with what she felt and allow herself to feel it. It was a quieter thing than she had expected. Not the dramatic collapse of a wall, but more like a door she had been holding shut from the inside, finally being released. "I love you," she said. "I am reasonably certain of it." He smiled at that, and she discovered that his smile, which she had seen before in fragments and half-versions, was at its full capacity something that did very effective things to her composure. He pulled her gently toward him, and she came without arguing, which was itself remarkable, and he put his arms around her, and she put her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the warm store in December with the frost outside and the full moon over the Kansas prairie, and she let herself stay there. Winter in Caldwell was a different world from summer. The trail dust settled, and the drovers were gone until spring, and the town pulled itself inward like a creature finding warmth. People visited each other more. Supper invitations became common. Margaret Healy hosted a Christmas gathering at the post office that she somehow turned into an annual tradition, despite the post office being an unlikely venue for festivity. Isaiah took Letitia to that gathering. They went together openly and without ceremony, which was itself a kind of announcement in a town that had been following their story with the attention of a reader who has been waiting for a good chapter. Margaret Healy, upon seeing them come through the door side by side, gave Isaiah such a look of vindicated satisfaction that he had to look away to hide his expression. The town received them well. Most of Caldwell, whatever their private opinions, was inclined to be pleased for Letitia, who had worked hard and been good to her customers, and never asked anything of anyone and deserved some happiness. There was some murmuring in the corners, people who thought a separated woman ought not to be in any romantic arrangement, people who thought Isaiah should have moved on rather than settling near a woman with legal complications, but those voices were in the minority and not particularly loud, and Letitia had long since decided she was not going to live her life according to the minority voice. Chester Pratt was at the gathering. He looked at them both with his small eyes and said nothing at all, and Isaiah looked back at him with complete pleasantness, and Letitia gave him the same courtesy she gave everyone, which was polite and exact and not a degree warmer than that. After the new year, Pratt made one final attempt. He went to the bank directly and tried to call in some pressure on Letitia's credit arrangement, claiming irregularities, which there were not. The letter Isaiah had written in the summer, and the impeccable documentation Letitia had sent, and the good standing she had maintained for 9 months all combined to make Pratt's effort look petty and unsuccessful. The bank wrote back to Letitia confirming her credit was in excellent standing. She showed Isaiah the letter and they had coffee over it at Delilah's, and she allowed herself a moment of deep satisfaction. Pratt did not try again after that. He grew smaller in the story of Caldwell and was eventually more notable for his failure to unseat Letitia Boone than for anything else. Spring came back in 1879 with a warmth that felt earned, the way warmth always does after a genuine winter. The first cattle drives began to move north again, and Letitia's store was busy, and the windows were clean and the shelves full and the ledger steady. She had sent word to Frank Henley in the fall about a proper house. There was a plot available 1 street back from Chisholm Street that she had her eye on, and the planning was underway. She intended to have her own house by summer. Isaiah's cattle operation was taking shape. He had built a good solid corral and had a beginning herd of 22 head and had hired a hand named Tobias, a young man from the Cherokee Strip who knew cattle and horses and was steady and reliable. The small house on the property was under construction. He was doing most of the work himself, with Tobias's help, because he had grown up knowing how to build things, and there was a satisfaction in building your own walls. In March, the letter came from the solicitor in Missouri. Letitia read it twice at the counter, alone in the morning before the store opened. It was a long letter, formal and detailed, but the substance of it was this. Thomas Boone, in the intervening period since Letitia had left, had formed a liaison with another woman in Joplin. Given the circumstances, and given that Letitia had engaged a good solicitor, and Thomas had apparently not contested certain claims, perhaps because the alternative would have exposed his own conduct, there was a path to a legal settlement that would sever the marriage formally and restore Letitia's full legal independence. It would take several more months and some additional documentation, but it was achievable. She set the letter down on the counter. She looked at the window, the clean glass that Frank Henley had put back in the frame. She looked at the shelves, orderly and full. She looked at the sign over the door from the inside, Boone Dry Goods and General Supply, the letters she had painted herself. She was extraordinarily good at containing things, but this morning she did not try. She let herself feel it. She let herself feel the relief, which was massive and quiet and warm. And she let herself feel the possibility of what came after relief, which was a kind of freedom she had been pointing herself toward for almost 2 years and could now, finally, see clearly. When Isaiah came in that morning, she handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. He read it again. He looked up at her. She was watching him with those green eyes that did everything they had always done, which was to catch the light and hold it. "Letitia," he said. "It's not settled yet," she said. "It'll be several months still, but the path is clear. The solicitor thinks it's straightforward from here." He put the letter down on the counter. "How do you feel?" he said. "I feel," she said slowly, "like a window that someone cleaned." A pause. That was not a very eloquent way to put it. "It was perfect," he said. She looked at him. "I have a question," she said, "and I want you to answer it honestly and not because you think it's the right answer." "Always," he said. "Is this something you want?" She said, "A full life, with me, with whatever that looks like here, with a dry goods store on Chisholm Street and a cattle operation to the south and a house in between. Is that something you actually want and not just something you've been patient about waiting for?" He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "It's the most honest yes I've ever said." She nodded once, as if he had confirmed something she had calculated carefully and found to be correct. "All right, then," she said. She went around the counter and stood in front of him and put her hands on his face, which she had not done before, and looked at him very directly. "I love you, Isaiah Dawson," she said. "I have loved you since about the middle of October, and I have been thoroughly annoyed at myself for it, and I am choosing to stop being annoyed." He put his hands over hers. "That is the most characteristic declaration of love I have ever received," he said. "Is that a complaint?" she said. "Not remotely," he said. He kissed her, which was also new and not at all a small thing. She kissed him back in the way she did everything, which was with her full attention, and without any reservation she had not already decided to set aside. Margaret Healy walked past the store window at that precise moment, and saw them through the glass, and went directly to the post office, and sat down and thought about how satisfying it was when things went correctly. The legal process in Missouri took until August of 1879. It was slow and bureaucratic, and required 2 more letters to the solicitor and 1 affidavit and a great deal of patience. Letitia handled it with the same meticulous efficiency she brought to her accounts. When the final document arrived, formal, stamped, legal, she held it and read it to the bottom, and then she put it in the strong box she kept under the floorboard in the back room of the store, where she kept things that were important and safe. She told Isaiah that evening at his land, where she had come to see the progress on the house. It was nearly done, the walls up and the roof on, the big window in the front framing a view of the cottonwood trees along the creek. He had been waiting for her on the porch, such as it was, a rough-hewn step and a small flat area in front of the door. She said, "It's done," he said. "Then let's not waste any more time." She laughed. It was not a small laugh or a careful one. It came from somewhere that had been closed for a long time and was now fully open. They were married in Caldwell on a Saturday in September of 1879, in the church that was sometimes a schoolhouse, by the minister whose wife had been trying to guide Letitia's social life since April of the previous year, and who was somewhat triumphant about the whole affair. It was a simple ceremony. Letitia wore a pale blue dress she had made herself from the best calico she stocked, which she considered an appropriate and economical choice. Isaiah wore a clean dark coat he had purchased from Chester Pratt's store specifically, which was a small act of generosity toward a man he did not particularly like, and also a demonstration that the war was over. Margaret Healy cried, decorously, from the third row. Cora Simmons threw dried flower petals from a basket. Old Abe Simmons shook Isaiah's hand so hard that it was still slightly sore the next day. They ate at Delilah's eating house with a group of perhaps 20 people who had become the community that surrounded them, and there was music from a fiddle player named Garrett who sat up in the corner and played until 10 o'clock, and Letitia danced, which surprised everyone including herself. She danced with Isaiah, specifically, who was a better dancer than she had expected, and who held her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, completely present, not performing. "You dance well," she told him. "I had sisters who needed a practice partner," he said. "You should write them about this," she said. "I already did," he said, 2 weeks ago. They wrote back 3 letters combined. She looked at him. "You wrote them 2 weeks ago." "I was optimistic," he said. She shook her head, but she was smiling, and the smile was not one of the careful, contained ones. It was the full version with her whole face, the one that she had been keeping so far inside for so long that it had not seen much daylight, and now it was out and he was the reason, and she had stopped arguing about whether or not that was acceptable. She moved her store's accounts into the house that was on the plot she had purchased on the street behind Chisholm, which had been built to her specifications with wide shelves in the back room for the business records, and a real kitchen, and good large windows that caught the morning light. Isaiah's house on the land was the ranch house, and he stayed there through the week when the cattle needed daily management, and came back to town most evenings, and they worked out the logistics of 2 people with 2 separate enterprises with the same practical approach they had always applied to things. It was, she thought, a good arrangement. It was a real partnership, which was a thing she had not known was possible until she had won. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and clear, and the cattle operation made it through in good health, which Isaiah said was more than a lot of people could claim. Tobias had been joined by a second hand, a man named Carter, and the operation was beginning to look like what Isaiah had originally imagined when he walked the land south of Caldwell in that first summer. The cattle herd was up to 48 head and growing in the right direction. Letitia's store had its best year. She had expanded into a second room of the storefront. The space next door had come available when a saddler moved to Wichita, and she now carried a wider range of goods and had taken on a part-time helper, a girl of 19 named Adeline from a farm family east of town, who turned out to have both competence and enthusiasm, which was a rarer combination than people assumed. In the spring of 1880, Letitia told Isaiah, on a Tuesday morning over coffee, that they were going to have a child. She said it the way she said things, directly and without preamble, but he heard the slight texture in her voice that was not the usual even tone. He set his coffee down. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm well. The baby is well, according to Doc Preston." She paused. "I am also frightened, if you want the honest account." "I always want the honest account," he said. "I haven't exactly planned for this particular thing," she said. "The store, the house, the law, those I planned. This is different." "It is different," he agreed. "Are you frightened?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said, "and very glad." She looked at him. "Both at once," she said. "Both at once," he said. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. which was still her characteristic way of bridging the last small distance when she wanted to and had decided to stop arguing about wanting to. "Both at once," she said again, as if testing the phrase and finding it sufficient. "That seems accurate." The pregnancy was unremarkable in the best way, meaning it proceeded without serious incident, which in Caldwell in 1880 was about the best one could hope for. Letitia continued running the store through most of the spring and summer, leaving more to Adeline as she grew larger and as the work became more physically difficult. She was not gracious about the physical limitations. She found them intensely irritating and said so to Isaiah's general quiet amusement. "You could sit down more," he observed once. "I'm aware of that option," she said. "And you're choosing not to," he said. "I'm choosing to manage my own store," she said, "for as long as that is medically responsible." Doc Preston drew the line at 6 weeks before, and Letitia agreed to it with barely concealed reluctance, and spent those 6 weeks doing accounts and writing correspondence and reorganizing systems, and telling Adeline exactly what to do so thoroughly that Adeline could probably have run the store by herself for a year. Their son was born in September of 1880. They named him James Henry Dawson, for Letitia's father, whose given name was Henry, and for Isaiah's grandfather James, who had been a man of the same quiet determination that had apparently run through the family across several generations. He was born healthy and loud, which Doc Preston said was the best sign, and he had gray eyes like his father and brown hair like his mother, and Letitia held him and looked at him with an expression Isaiah had never seen on her face before, which was not carefully calculated or methodically determined. It was simply wonder, open and whole and undefended. He stood beside her and looked at his son and felt something so large he could not have described it, and he did not try. He just put his arm around Letitia's shoulders and she leaned into him, which she had become able to do in the past year without having to think about it first, and they were both quiet for a long time. Margaret Healy brought a chicken and a pie. Old Abe brought firewood, because he said a house with a newborn needed to be warm. Cora brought a quilt she had made over the summer, and it was a beautiful quilt. Adeline ran the store with perfect competence and brought Letitia a full accounting at the end of every week. Life in Caldwell in the years that followed arranged itself into the shape of something real and solid. Isaiah's cattle operation grew slowly and steadily, the way good things do when they're built carefully. By 1882, he had nearly 100 head and had purchased the land from old Holcomb outright, when Holcomb decided it was time to go live with his daughter in Abilene. The ranch house on that land was expanded, a second room added, a proper barn built beside the original structure. Letitia's store was the most reliable business on Chisholm Street and possibly in Caldwell. Chester Pratt, who had spent 2 years being quietly bitter, eventually sold his store to a young man from Ohio and retired, and his retirement was not mourned in any particular way by the people who had known what he was. The new man was straightforward and fair, and Letitia had no trouble with him. She hired Adeline full-time in 1881. In 1882, she made Adeline a junior partner in the store, which caused something of a stir in Caldwell because nobody had seen a woman do that before, make another woman a partner in a formal business arrangement. Letitia pointed out that Adeline had earned it and that business sense did not care about the gender of its possessor, and this logic, delivered in Letitia's particular direct fashion, was difficult to argue with. In the fall of 1882, James was 2 years old and walking and saying words with increasing confidence and causing mild chaos in both the store and the house, because he had inherited his father's physical steadiness and his mother's absolute determination, which in a 2-year-old translated to getting into everything with patient thoroughness. Isaiah found him one afternoon when Letitia had brought the boy to the store while Adeline was on a supply run, standing next to the hardware shelf carefully examining a length of rope with the concentrated expression of a person conducting a serious investigation. "James," Isaiah said. The boy looked up. "That's not a toy," Isaiah said. James looked at the rope and then at his father and appeared to consider this assessment. "Come here," Isaiah said, and James came without a fuss, because he was by nature an even-tempered child who responded well to a plain statement. Isaiah picked him up and settled him against his shoulder, and the boy grabbed a handful of his father's shirt and was content. Letitia came through from the back room and saw them and stopped, and the expression on her face was the same one she had had in the first moments after James was born, the undefended wonder, the one that she no longer bothered to put away. "He was investigating the rope," Isaiah said. "He investigates everything," she said. She came and stood beside them and looked at her son, who had by now turned his attention to something outside the window that he found interesting. "He's very thorough." "He gets that from you," Isaiah said. "He gets a great many things from me," she said. "It is both gratifying and occasionally alarming." Isaiah smiled. She leaned against his free shoulder the way she had learned to do, without ceremony, the way a person leans against a wall they trust completely. In the spring of 1883, she told him she was expecting again. This time she was not frightened in the same way. Or rather, she was a little frightened, because she was honest about the real risks of these things in 1883 Kansas, and she did not pretend to be braver than she was. But the wonder was there too, alongside the fear, and it was bigger than the fear, and she had learned enough in the years since the river and the store and the December evening when he said "I love you" without elaboration, to let the bigger thing be bigger. Their second child, a girl, was born in November of 1883. They named her Clara, which was the name of Isaiah's eldest sister, who wrote a letter so full of emotion when she received the news that it took 2 pages and still seemed to have more in it than the paper could hold. Clara had dark eyes, which was different from James, and a temper that announced itself very clearly and very early, and which everyone who knew her parents found entirely unsurprising. James, at 3 years old, regarded his sister with the serious interest of a person encountering a new and complicated phenomenon. He brought her once a small stone he had found that he considered to be of good quality, and presented it to her where she lay in the cradle, and then seemed somewhat puzzled by her failure to appreciate it. "She'll grow into it," Isaiah told him. James considered this and accepted it. The town of Caldwell had changed in those years, as towns on the cattle trail did. The Chisholm Trail was winding down by the mid-1880s. The railroads were pushing south and the trail drive was becoming less necessary. Caldwell adapted as it had before. Some people left. New people came. The cattle operations that had put down roots, like Isaiah's, were becoming more permanent features of the landscape rather than seasonal enterprises. Letitia's store continued. It was different from when she had first opened it, bigger, more established, with Adeline as a genuine partner and a third employee. A young man named William who turned out to be good at bookkeeping, which freed Letitia's mornings for the things she found more interesting, which was everything else. She had expanded into wholesale at some point, supplying 3 smaller stores in the county, which had been Isaiah's idea, and which she had developed into something he had not entirely anticipated because she was very good at developing things. She wrote to her solicitor in Missouri once more in 1884, not about Thomas, that was long settled, but about her father's estate, which had sat in partial limbo since his death, a small property in Joplin that had never been fully resolved. The solicitor sorted it out. The property was sold and the proceeds sent to her. It was not a large sum, but it was her father's, and she put it in James and Clara's account at the bank in Wichita and made a note in the ledger that it was there. One evening in the autumn of 1884, she and Isaiah sat on the porch of the house in town. She had added a proper porch, because she had decided she wanted one with the children in bed and the street quiet and the early dark coming down over Caldwell with all its stars. The Kansas stars were extravagant in the fall, thick and unreasonably bright, as if the sky was trying to compensate for the sparseness of the landscape. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask," he said. "Are you happy?" she said. She said it directly, the way she said everything. With the way things are. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the stars, which she often did when she was asking something that mattered. "Yes," he said, "I am, genuinely, completely." "And you're not saying that because it's the thing to say," she said. "When have I ever said things because they were the thing to say?" he said. She considered. "Never," she said. "That is an accurate defense." He reached over and took her hand, which was also not as deliberate a gesture as it used to be. It was something they did naturally now, without deciding to, which had taken some time and was one of his favorite things about the life they had built. "Are you," he said, "happy?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not an uncertain quiet, but a considering one, the kind she used when she wanted to give a real answer. "I am the happiest I have ever been," she said. Which is a statement I could not have believed I would say 4 years ago, or 6 years ago, or 8 years ago. She paused. I spent a very long time thinking that what I felt was a sufficient replacement for what I didn't allow myself to have. It turns out they are not the same thing. "No," he said, "they're not." "I needed you," she said. It was said simply, without the difficulty it might have had once. That was the thing I was most wrong about, the needing. I thought it was weakness. I was mistaken about that. He held her hand and they sat on the porch together, and the stars went on being extravagant over Caldwell, Kansas, and somewhere down the street. A horse shifted at a hitching post, and the night said what nights say on the open prairie. "You know what Margaret told me," he said, "back in that first summer." "What did she say?" Letitia said. "She said she had never seen a woman so determined not to be happy," he said. "She said it with admiration, not criticism. She thought you were the bravest person she'd ever met." Letitia was quiet. "She told you that?" "She told me a great many things," he said. "Margaret has never had a thought she didn't eventually share." "What did you think when she said that?" Letitia said. He thought about it honestly, the way he always did. "I thought she was right," he said. "And I thought that if a person was that determined not to be happy, it probably meant they wanted it very much. And that if someone could be patient enough and honest enough, eventually they might be allowed close enough to help." He looked at her. "I thought it was worth trying to be that person." She turned and looked at him in the dark, and her expression was one that she had been wearing more easily in recent years, the one that was not calculated or defended or precise, the one that was just her looking at him. "It was worth trying," she said. She leaned over and kissed him, there on the porch in the autumn night, which was the kind of thing they could do now without it being momentous, just the ordinary and extraordinary act of two people who had chosen each other and were very glad of the choice. James was 4, and Clara was almost 1, and the cattle operation was running well, and the store on Chisholm Street had Boone dry goods and general supply over the door in the same letters she had painted herself in 1878, though she had repainted them twice, and they were sharper now and cleaner. The letters that had meant independence when she painted them the first time now meant something larger, not just independence but the life around the independence, the people and the love and the ordinary days that turned out to be the actual thing. 5 years later, in 1889, when the unassigned lands opened up and the territory around Kansas was changing again, and people were talking about Oklahoma and new starts, and the ever-moving edge of the frontier, Letitia and Isaiah sat down and had a long, careful conversation about whether they were going to stay. It was the kind of conversation that two people who are genuinely equal in a partnership have, where no one decides and no one follows, but they think it through together and arrive somewhere together. They were going to stay. Caldwell was their place. Isaiah's cattle land was built into something real and good. The store was established, and Adeline was now a full partner with a claim on the building as real as Letitia's own. James was 9 years old and in school 5 days a week, and had his father's gray eyes and his mother's mathematical mind, and a very particular way of looking at things sideways before he made any judgment, which his parents recognized in each other and found amusing and touching in equal measure. Clara was 5, and she had strong opinions about everything, which did not surprise anyone. She had told Adeline once, standing in the store with complete seriousness, that she was going to run the store when she was grown, and Adeline had said that was an excellent plan, and Clara had nodded as if this had been confirmed rather than encouraged. Letitia heard the story and told Isaiah that evening, and they both laughed in the way that parents laugh at their children with love that is so large it has to come out as something. By 1890, the Chisholm Trail was effectively finished. The era of the great cattle drives was over, replaced by the railroad and by settled ranching operations like Isaiah's, which sent cattle to market through the stockyards at Kansas City without the long drive north. The wild years of Caldwell were becoming something people told stories about, and some of those stories got larger in the telling, as stories do. The real story, the one that had happened on a Tuesday morning in June of 1878, when a quiet drover bought work gloves and 2 lengths of rope from a woman who didn't need anyone, and then kept coming back. That story was not the kind that got told in saloons or written up in newspapers. It was the ordinary kind. The kind that happens in a store over coffee, by a river in the dark, on a porch under extravagant stars. But ordinary was, Letitia had learned, exactly right. She stood in her store on a clear morning in the fall of 1890, at 40 years old, and thought that she looked like herself. Not the reduced version, not the carefully maintained fortress of the woman she had been in 1878, but herself full and intact, and with a life that fit her precisely, because she had built it herself, with her own hands, with the help of a man who had never once tried to make any part of her smaller. Adeline came in from the back with a question about a supply order. Letitia answered it and made a note in the ledger and looked out the window at Chisholm Street, where the light was doing what Kansas light does in October, making everything gold and clear and very beautiful. Isaiah came in at mid-morning, the way he did most days when he came in from the land. He had gray in his hair now, not much, but enough that she had mentioned it once, and he had said she was one to talk, and she had said she had no idea what he meant, and they had both been lying and both knew it and both didn't care. He came to the counter and she handed him a cup of coffee because she had made it when she heard his horse outside, which she would never have admitted to doing and which she did every morning without thinking about it. James's teacher sent a note, she said. Good or bad, he said. Good, she said. He helped a younger student with arithmetic. She wanted us to know. Isaiah smiled. He drank his coffee. He looked at her over the rim of the cup with those gray eyes that were still, after 12 years of marriage, exactly as steady as they had always appeared to be. I love you, he said. He still said it regularly, which she had once found slightly surprising and now found indispensable. I love you, she said back. She said it easily, the way a person says something true that they have said 1,000 times and mean the same way every time. The door opened and Clara came in from school, which was just down the block, her braids slightly undone and her coat not buttoned correctly, and her expression already working up towards something she wanted to say. Mama, she said, can I have a piece of candy, and also I have a question about whether it is possible to own a horse. Yes to the candy, Letitia said, and the answer to the horse question is that is a conversation for this evening. Clara accepted this with the grace of a person who knows the negotiation is not over, which it absolutely wasn't. She took her piece of hard candy and sat down on the customer chair by the door and looked out at the street with the proprietary interest of a child who has decided this will all be hers someday. Isaiah caught Letitia's eye over Clara's head. Letitia shook her head slightly, the gesture that meant she's your daughter when she's like this, and Isaiah's expression said she is absolutely your daughter and I have the evidence. Outside, Caldwell went about its morning. The street was ordinary and busy and real. The sign over the door said what it had always said. The ledger was balanced. The children were accounted for. The cattle were well. The man across the counter had steady gray eyes and coffee in his hands, and 12 years of mornings that had been better than the one before because he was in them. Letitia had told the whole town she needed no one. She had been right about many things in her life, and she had been very specifically wrong about that one. She was grateful, in the way that people are grateful for things that correct them when they need correcting, not embarrassed by the wrongness, but genuinely glad that she had been given the chance to find out. She opened the ledger to a new page and wrote the date across the top in her careful hand, and the morning light came through the window, and everything was exactly as it should be.